Dr. Okocha, a Chief Executive Officer of NHS Oxleas.
I remember my mom wailing and crying and repeatedly saying, "This is not what we discussed. This is not what we talked about." You hear that from someone you love so dearly, you don't have a choice. There's no question in my mind about that. None at all.
How did your dad die?
Firstly, doctors were on strike. My father had a stomach ulcer. The ulcer burst and bled, so he vomited a lot of blood. The only solution, as you can imagine, blood transfusion and surgery to tie it up. And doctors were on strike. That's the thing that pivoted me to medical school.
Is it ever justified for a medical professional, high-stake career to go on strike? And would you say that the blood of your father is in the hands of those people that decided to go on strike?
I understand where resident doctors are coming from, but there's a distinction.
You came to the UK as a doctor and you recall some level of discrimination.
Yes.
During your time as a resident doctor. What was it like?
It was quite unspeakable. People kind of treating you as though you have no common sense, let alone being a doctor. It's a very fortunate event that helped me get out of that. And I think that had that not happened, I would have found it really difficult, because at the time, if you were a foreign doctor, it was very difficult for you to get a job in London. Very difficult. And I met with one of the professors and said, would it be okay if I join your ward so I can keep myself up to date with psychiatry? And he remarked, I thought we agreed we won't employ people like you.
What do you say to people who are currently working in the NHS or in the healthcare field, and they feel like they are facing this discrimination?
I think that humans, by our very nature, it's inevitable. It's about how do you make sure that if only one person is needed, that you are that one person based on your expertise.
Do you think that a lot of Christians are using faith as crutches?
Sometimes it's not just about what we spout, what we say, but it's also about how we do stuff, that attracts people to God.
We have instances, you see people commit murder, you see people do these heinous crimes, and you then later hear that they had a mental problem, and then they're put into psychiatry and mental treatment. Do you think that that is a cop-out for a lot of cases?
I want to say a few things.
Welcome everyone to another Soul episode. And today's guest is someone whose career has been defined by resilience, brilliance, and leadership in one of the toughest fields, mental health. Dr. Okocha qualified as a doctor in 1985. He became a psychiatrist and went on to earn a PhD from King's College London in psychosis and psychopharmacology. He has since risen to become not only a consultant psychiatrist, but also a chief executive officer of NHS Oxleas. He is decorated with national awards and on the Roll of Honor of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. On a personal level, he went from losing his father at the age of 14, which inspired his decision to become a doctor, to battling discrimination and self-doubt when he first moved to the UK. Dr. Ife's story is one of purpose, and he is proof that leadership is forged in challenge and not necessarily comfort. Dr. Ife, welcome.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you for all of those kind words that you've just said. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. I wanted to dive deep into you, and what I see when I look at your story is there are a lot of things that happened when you were young that has basically shaped your career and who you are today. And there is a lot of wisdom to be gotten from that lived experience. And one of them is the fact that you have said that you were sent to a boarding school from the age of 9/10. What was it like as a young boy, essentially, sent to a boarding school far away from familiar faces, from parents, and people that you perhaps have trusted or you see as the people to secure you for security. What was it like going to this new territory far away from everybody?
Thanks. Really quite challenging, So when I go back to that time, the picture I want to paint is of living in a home where you got up, you got in the car, you got driven to school, you finished school, I think maybe 1:30, I can't quite remember, you got picked up, you got taken back home for lunch, you do your homework, etc. To then transition to somewhere that took 6 to 8 hours by coach away from your family home, to a dormitory where you had to go perhaps 500 yards, maybe 600 to get water, to have your shower, to do your laundry, and you had to every week do what was described as manual labor. So you had a portion of grass to cut, and every Saturday you had to do inspection, which was about tidying up your corner of the dormitory, making sure the surroundings were cleaned. And as a first year secondary school student with upper sixth uh, 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 what were prefects instructing you what to do. So you can imagine, it was very, very different from what I was accustomed to. Incredibly different. And I would say that it probably took me 2 years or 3 years to really get into the swing of things to then concentrate on my studies, if that makes sense. So the first year was
Yeah.
a case of, well, going through the motions, and then got to Form 2, a bit of going through the motions until maybe the third term, and then really wrapping my head around all of that to then study. And then, of course, by the time you got into the third year, the curriculum at the time was such that that's when your future was defined, a science student or an art student, because that then determined if what class you got into in your fourth year, a science class, a pure science class, a mid science class, or an art class. And so I think the second year towards the latter part, the third quarter was when I really kind of wrapped my head around all of this, going into
Mm.
some of all that stuff, and also the need to study. Not that there wasn't time to study, because you had your morning prep, you had your siesta, you had your evening prep after sports, really quite organized. But it was just getting from one to the other, stuff that one wasn't really accustomed.
But what kind of mental fortitude does that develop in a child 9, 10, 11, where you have to, you're practically put through a strict structure and discipline, things that you must do at certain times. Cutting grass, for example, we've all seen the news of somebody that is pretty popular in the UK talking about her experience cutting grass and all of that. What's your view of that? Was it a positive where it shaped your mental fortitude, or was it something that did more harm than good?
I think certainly positive. There's no question in my mind. There were a number of things that when I look back, were shaped, So you had to learn to form friendships to the extent that by the time I got to my third, fourth, and final year, going back to school was something to look forward to, because you had
Really?
friends you wanted to see, you wanted to talk to, you wanted to do stuff with. And so, no, all of that, frankly, positive. I don't know if you had interviewed me then, what I would have said, but when I look back now, I wouldn't give it up for anything. Certainly,
Really?
definitely not. I am part of a WhatsApp group today of people I went to secondary school with.
Wow.
So we're talking about how many years ago? 50 years ago. You know,
Wow.
so I certainly wouldn't, because even though I didn't know it at the time, but as life carried on, you kind of drew strength from the things that you experienced back then.
What did that have, or what sort of effect did that have on the relationship that you had with your parents, right? That had sent you. So suddenly you go from, like you
Yes.
described, seeing them
Yes.
so frequently to not seeing them at all.
So what I will say is that from my father's perspective, his reason for that was you are capable. And until the very day that I recall traveling, it was always, you sure you want to do this? Or would you rather not do it? You sure you want to do this? So it was conveyed in a supportive way, you know. Um, and so I never felt at any point that this was about off you go. But of course, not having a sense of what it would feel like, I've got to say that the first few weeks were a bit of a shock, pretty traumatic,
Yeah.
But just realizing that it wasn't couched in the form that I described. There was a lot of letter writing between my dad and myself, so it's not like now we
Mm.
had mobile phones, and I mean there were telephones, but you had to go to the principal's office or someone's office to make a call, and so it was back and forth letter writing. There was a family doctor there. You had money. Had to open a post office account. So again, there were some positives when I look back in terms of being able to manage money. If I went to boarding school, I had to write a list of what I needed. I had to go get those things. I had to be clear about how much money I needed, and then and in fact, by the time I got to my third year, I made it my habit to give an account of how I had spent the money, even though looking
Mm.
back, it wasn't necessary. But it was just that notion of this is the amount of money I got, I put it in this post office account, and this is how I spent the money. That all too often there was some money left over. But
Mm.
yeah. So I didn't know it then, but in some ways, it kind of really made a difference. But those relationships that I formed were really instrumental, really, because even though I left there after my fifth year, I went on to do my A levels back in Lagos and traveled from home. Some of my friends went to the same A level school as I did, and then we got into university together. So really formative.
Yeah, there are two things that are playing in my mind as I
Sure.
as I hear your story. One of them is the way your father prepared you for what is to come. It was sort of I mean, no one could have prepared you for what is to come, but
Sure.
in the sense that he carried you along with that decision. It wasn't sort of this is what you're doing, which is what some of us are used to. Your parents saying this is what you're doing, and
Sure.
it's not a conversation.
Sure.
You do it. It
Sure.
was seems to me that it was more of, okay, this is what I would like you to do. What do you think? Do you
Sure.
like it? Are you sure you want to do it?
Sure.
And then the other part of it that I want to get your opinion on is when you took on that responsibility, essentially, of taking care of yourself, managing money, managing risk. Do we then say there is part of your childhood that you are having to miss out on because you had to grow up so quickly? Because not many 10-year-old is thinking about how do I manage my money, but you've had to do that.
Yes. I mean, that's an interesting point. I suppose part of the reason why it's quite possible over time I've kind of given it a positive spin. But one of the reasons, and I was having this discussion with my grandson only a week or 2 weeks ago, and he couldn't believe it. Come on, Granddad, how could you have gone to secondary school that early? And he said, you must have missed a class. And I said, yes, I did, in fact, miss a couple of classes. So I went to a private school that ended in class 5, and most people left from class 5 to secondary school. I went from class 3 to secondary school. So you may look at that and say, well, did my father think that I was quite capable and therefore thought, you'll be fine? You know, there's a part of me that wants to believe that that was the case, and if that was the case, then I have to just get on with it. So I went from class 4, I beg your pardon, not 3, class 4,
Yeah.
then I had to get on with it. Was there a part of my childhood that was missed? I wouldn't say so, because you had your contemporaries in your class, you had others in a higher class. I mean, what is it? What's childhood about if it's not about meeting your contemporaries, chatting, playing football, whatever it was, just that it was done in the context of boarding school. But what it then meant was each time I went back home on holidays, I didn't quite know people locally.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, so that bit. And I distinctly remember holidays almost being a bit boring, because it
Really?
was only the people who were in school with me who had come, traveled the 6 to 8 hours, that I could socialize with, because the people I went to primary school with had all dispersed and stuff,
Mm.
yeah.
What was the relationship like between you and your dad?
So my dad was very strict as a person, parents of that age. So I recall, even if I didn't have homework from school, he gave me homework, which he had to, which I had to deliver to him on his return from work. Have you done stuff? What have you done? And so that just paints a picture. And in this school, people always said to me, "Oh, you're Cosmos's son." So it was a
Mm.
sense of your dad is strict. You better behave because you don't want us telling your dad about what you've been up to. So my dad was an incredibly strict person, and you kind of knew your boundaries.
That reminds me of, I think, particularly in any culture, really, but particularly in ours, there is this notion of a family name, right? So, and you've alluded to that fact. It's kind of like my dad always tells me, remember the son of whom you are,
Yeah,
because whatever you do doesn't just affect you, it affects the
yeah,
family name
yeah.
that maybe people have grown to trust. Do you feel like you had that sort of pressure on you as well?
There's no question about that. There's no question about that. And even when I became really good friends with the son of the principal of the school, there was even more pressure because every time certainly on one occasion when I went out of school without exit and he found out, he wasn't lenient at all. you know, he just wasn't lenient at all. It was a case of, you're my son's good friend, you visit my son, and then I know your dad and you're doing this. You can't be doing stuff like this. Here's
Mm.
your punishment. So but that was that. Well, I saw it as a culture then. That every effort had to be made to ensure that you were on the straight and narrow.
You mentioned you saw it as a culture then. Do
Yeah.
you see it as a culture now? If not, do you think it should be a culture now?
No, I don't think it necessarily should be a culture now. So when I reflect on the so I'll give you an example. I was talking to a good friend of mine not too long ago, who said to me, "Oh, I wouldn't have dared as a child enter the same room that my father was sat in." I said, "Oh, really? How is that?" He said, "Oh, you just don't do stuff like that." I said, "Was that a good thing?" And he looked at me and said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, that's not right, is it? What about your children? How would you feel if they felt frightened to come into the same room that you were in?"
Mm.
And he said, "Oh, you hadn't thought about it." So it only becomes an issue in the context in which one is now, where it seems like a far fetched thing. But if you talked to lots of people at the time, many of one's contemporaries will have similar experiences of strict parenting and obviously being a psychiatrist, I think it's a combination of the fear that parents have that if they are not strict, their child may not achieve or accomplish or whatever, or may do stuff that will tarnish the family name or whatever it may be. And so rather than parent in a different way, which is about closeness and conversations, they feel that if you're familiar with your child, ooh, that could cause problems. When my children were growing up, we would sit and we'll have a conversation about stuff, because I thought it was
Mm,
more fun just having that conversation and making sure, but also drawing the line. So one of the things I say all the time is when my children were young, television was not an option during the week. Just not an option. Why? Because I didn't want them to rush their homework. I just didn't want television to get in the way. So there was clarity about you went to school, you came home, you did your homework. If there was outside activity you needed to do, fine. For bed, you read your bedtime story or a novel, you go to sleep. At the weekend, you can then do your extracurricular, if
mm.
there's other stuff.
So at what age does that end? So and I'll give you a context in terms of what I mean. So it is easy to say, well, not easy, but it makes more sense to say no TV during weekdays for maybe children of certain age up until a certain age. At some point, the TV doesn't face them anymore. It doesn't really matter. Now talking about older kids, say 15, 16, 17, how do you effectively draw a good balance between having conversation and making sure that there are structures and there's a boundary and all of that in place?
I think that parents of today have a tough time because there are far too many things that distract young people. But certainly, my children who are now in their 30s, when they were younger, this approach was adopted throughout their GCSE years, you know, and then at A levels, they had enough of studying to be getting on with that it then wasn't, frankly, it wasn't necessary for us to. And of course, we were conscious about not having TVs everywhere, so had one TV.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Some people have a TV in the kitchen,
yeah, yeah.
one in the laundry room.
Yeah, again, today things are really very different, and I see it. I see how challenging it is for parents to not give their child an iPad, for example, or a phone, or to watch some children's programs. And children nowadays will say, well, that program is educative, and maybe it is. But it's about that balance between a child being able to communicate. And so we would tease and say, when we were in primary school and even in secondary school, even though I went to a boarding school, there were no mobile phones. You had to talk to your friends. People read novels, you know.
Mm.
You talked about what you had read in that novel and what novel you wanted to swap with someone. We still had a life, you know.
Yeah.
It's just that all of that has now been replaced largely with a lot of screen time. Talk less of the added burden today of social media. That's totally different. It is challenging, and there is evidence that we're seeing a number of younger people with all manner of difficulties. I speak as a psychiatrist and a healthcare worker on account of the impact of social media, etc.
So from the perspective of a psychiatrist and to a young parent like myself, what would be the best way to counteract or to raise a child in this environment? There's now rise of AI.
Yeah,
That's another thing entirely,
yeah.
even more dangerous.
So it's difficult to talk about the best way because I'm not sure that there's any one way that's the best way. I have seen some academics who would argue that even computer games may be helpful for some young people. I think that what is really important is that connection with a young person where there's the opportunity and the ability to communicate and convey one's anxieties, one's expectations, etc. That I think is really, really important. That my son recently, we all went away with his family, and I teased him. I said, a familiar place. I said, "Oh, do you remember this place?" So, "Yes, I do, Dad. All those coming on holidays here with my books and making sure I had studied before we went anywhere else." And his wife said, "Oh, really?" So my wife said, "Well, not all the time, but if you had exams, there was a rule. You came out, you studied for 2 or 3 hours, and then we went out and we had all the fun we could have." But it was just that need,
Mm.
different generation, but coming back to this generation, to have those sorts of conversations. Not always easy, because there isn't a way that one says is the best way. There really isn't. And another colleague of mine, I recall, in a square area of about maybe half a mile, 3 schools, and she lived within that half a mile, and her children were all in different schools. I said, "What's this about?" I said, "Well, because I understand a child. I've chosen the school that I think will help them play to their strengths."
Mm.
So there's a lot of work for parents to do in terms of quickly trying to understand their children, trying to think about how they can play to their children's strengths and what will help to strengthen their children and get them into a good position.
So it's really about understanding your child because every child is different,
Correct.
and playing towards the strength of
Correct.
the child would really. So do you think that a lot of the issues that parents have with parenting children is a big, massive misunderstanding?
It's not as simple as massive misunderstanding, but I think it's a combination of parental fear, parental experience, and how do you then make sure that you don't project onto your child those fears, or you don't necessarily use your experience, and that you also give the child a bit of a voice, but in a boundaried way. So it may not be a massive misunderstanding. Of course, there's some children who, in spite of all your best efforts, will insist on doing things knowingly or unknowingly in a particular way, but at least you need to be able to convey in as clear and as simple way the information that you want to convey about what's going to happen, consequences, etc. And that one has to keep just doing that.
Yeah, another significant event that happened in your early years that has really shaped your career was at the age of 14. You mentioned that your dad died just as you were finishing your exams.
Sure.
What was that time like? What did it feel like hearing
Ter-
that?
Terrible, terrible. So if you imagine I was 6 or 8 hours away, and then an evening hearing the news that my father had just died. And of course, the school I went to was in my hometown, and the body had just been brought back. I still remember it like it happened yesterday. And I still remember the weeks and months that followed of turmoil and depression and uncertainty about the future. And in fact, at the time, ship of five, I was number five, although I've lost my oldest brother a few years ago, but at the time, five of us. And only my oldest brother was the one that had gone into university. And all I thought about was, I've got to go and work because somehow we've got to be able to have people go to university and then it will be my turn. But there was
Mm.
just so much heartache and sadness and they're just not understanding. How could this be? Unexpected, never imagined it. There had been other deaths, of course, my uncles and the impact of the Nigerian Civil War, people that I knew and people I didn't know, and all of that. But I just couldn't. And there are still aspects of it that, till this day, I would say haunt me, and I know it because I'm a psychiatrist. That suddenness, that uncertainty, and that worry, you know. And a very good friend of mine who is a financial advisor said to me a few years ago, "You're overinsured." An example, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can imagine, yeah, where you just don't want. It's one thing to lose someone physically, but it's another thing to make sure that the impact isn't that bad. Unfortunately for me, none of those things I feared happened because I went straight into A levels and then the university without losing any time at all. Didn't have to work. In fact, never worked until I qualified as a doctor.
And was that as a result of the preparation that he had put in place or something else?
Not so much that. So something else that I think my father as a person was really determined to look after his children. I say this partly because although it was fairly common for people in his position, but we all went to private primary schools. Secondary school was fee paying, of course. And one of the things he was very keen to do was for my mother to be at home looking after the children, even though, for my memory, the first two were also in boarding school, and it was just the last three of us who were in primary school, you know. And I think that 2 or 3 years before he died, that my mother was very keen to support financially. And I don't recall personally the discussions or the debates, but I know that this was something that unfolded following his death, that he was opposed, but eventually he agreed. And my mother opened what you might describe in this country as a corner shop, you know. And when I reflect, I think, my goodness, that then became at least a source of income. The house was owned. There was some money because he had retired at the age of 50 and died shortly after. And so you kind of felt okay. But to your question, the fact that he had died, the knowledge that the responsibility has now shifted to my mother, and I would hope the discipline of being able to just single-mindedly pursue a plan. So it became a privilege that my mother was saying, "I will deal with this. You got to just go study," you know. And from my 2 years at A levels, 5 years at medical school, all of those 7 years, I don't think there's anyone you'll come across today who will say to you that if one of his characteristics is not focus. And
Mm.
friends that I've known 25 years in this country who are not Nigerians, who will always say the one thing about him, discipline and focus, And I think that all of that probably may have been from those earlier years. And then, of course, the consequence of his death and the need to, I mean, I couldn't imagine saying to my mom, "Oh, well, didn't want to study or I didn't pass that exam," given the sacrifice that she had lost a husband, she had a responsibility for 5 children, and that was the only thing that she could see that she had to do. I remember during my dad's burial, my mom wailing and crying and repeatedly saying, "This is not what we discussed. This is
Mm.
not what we talked about. We never talked about you leaving me with these children. How am I going to get through with these children?" I mean, you hear that from someone you love so dearly, and then they're putting in everything. You don't have a choice. There's no question in my mind about that. None at all. That she was carrying this responsibility, doing her bit, and there's no choice.
And how did your dad die?
it was really unfortunate. I mean, I only got to understand when I was in medical school. Firstly, Nigerian doctors were on strike. Didn't quite know at the time that my father had a stomach ulcer. The ulcer burst and bled, so he vomited a lot of blood. And the typical picture, which I got to learn of in medical school, is the first vomit, a lot of blood, and then you feel comfortable.
Mm.
You have a second vomit, it's inevitable, and the only solution, as you can imagine, blood transfusion and surgery to tie it up. And doctors were on strike. No teaching hospital, Luth wouldn't have him because they were on strike. The private doctor, private family doctor, said he couldn't do anything. Couldn't have done anything anyway because he needed theatre and he needed blood transfusion. So that again was a harrowing experience, which was the one thing. Not sure why to this day, but that's the thing that pivoted me to medical school. Because until that equivalent of GCSEs, I wasn't sure. He was an accountant, and I thought, well, maybe that. I loved. We had flowers in front of our house. I liked watering flowers. That was always the opportunity to chat with him because he liked to sit outside, and I just wasn't sure. But that event made me think, right, I've got to be a doctor. Still don't know why, but he did, and here I am.
And there's a lot of talks, especially in the United Kingdom, where we talk about nurses or doctors, medical staff going on strikes. You are someone who has, I suppose, dealt with and experienced the very nature or consequences of such important people and personnel going on strike. Is it ever justified for a medical professional, high stake career to go on strike? And would you say that the blood of your father is in the hands of those people that decided to go on strike? What's your opinion?
I've never been in support. Fortunately, throughout the time I was training, never personally went on strike, even as a consultant. Never, you know. It's fair to say that I understand where resident doctors are coming from, but there's a distinction, nevertheless, which is that in this country, emergency services are protected. So, emergency services must run in this country. It's the non-emergency services that are affected by a strike, whereas a strike that occurred in 1978 was such that everything shut down. All of that said, the ideal position to be in is no strikes. But people ask me, what are my personal views? And I say, well, I'm not in support of strikes. But I understand why it is done. Inevitably, someone dies. Inevitably. For all manner of reasons. Someone deteriorates, some people die, etc.
Okay. So you came to the UK as a doctor,
Yeah.
and you recall some level of discrimination
Yes.
during your time as a resident doctor. What was it like?
Yes. So it was really quite it was quite unspeakable when I look back, both in terms of people really this was in Kent, not in London. People kind of treating you as though you have no common sense, let alone being a doctor. And then even as a doctor, fortunately, not discrimination from patients, interesting enough, when I reflect, at least I don't remember any. but people really almost challenging your knowledge and what you know. And of course, this was at a time when there was quite a lot of discrimination against foreign doctors in the UK. You couldn't advance or anything of the sort. It was just none. You just couldn't advance in your career and stuff, you know. But again, as luck would have it, I remember my registrar at the time who always seemed to minimize my efforts, always caricatured everything I did and would question my prescribing and stuff like that. But on account of that, I became even more conscientious. I needed to make sure that I was getting it right. And that
Mm,
conscientiousness led to what I can only describe as a very fortunate event that helped me get out of that, but also strengthened my confidence, which was about a young patient they had known for a while. He had been there longer than me, and they thought he had a severe and enduring mental illness, schizophrenia. I thought that at first until I watched him one day walk across the middle of the road, with a funny gait. That's the way he was walking. And I thought schizophrenia doesn't result in that. He looked confused, constantly rubbed his face, and I said to my consultant, I don't think this guy has schizophrenia. Let's try and figure out what it is. And of course, you can imagine what my registrar would have thought of me. you know. Anyway, the fortunate thing is that it turns out that the man had neurosyphilis, syphilis that had gone
mm.
into his brain, and all he needed was penicillin. So we
Wow.
got another consultant who deals with stuff like that, and had some shots of penicillin, and I still remember his name to this day. That's how he left the ward, and that's how he left hospital. And
Mm,
within a year or 18 months of starting in this country, I had my first publication in the British Medical Journal of this case, because syphilis had died down. But it was more a case of, hey, people could still be around, may not be as a venereal disease, but here is an example of syphilis affecting the brain, you know. And so that opened up, for me at least, unfortunately for me, what I really wanted to do, which was to do research. And so if you have a publication, people paid a bit of attention. That's how I got the research grant, got the opportunity to go pursue my PhD. And I think that had that not happened, I would have found it really difficult to, to
mm.
to make that transition going from Kent. Because at the time, if you were a foreign doctor, it was very difficult for you to get a job in London. Very difficult. Yeah,
Really?
yeah, yeah. Very.
I would have thought London was because I'm down or up north, um, and when we think about about London, we just think very diverse. It's for everybody.
So the places I got a job in Manchester, and it was North Manchester rotation. I said, I thought, well, it's not in the major rotation for training psychiatry. Then I went to Kent because it was nearer London, I got a job there, had some affiliation with London. But even before I passed the exams to then go into psychiatric training, I went to one of the teaching hospitals to say, and I met with one of the professors and said, I plan to use the library here to study for the exams, the BLAB exam. Would it be okay if I join your ward round so I can keep myself up to date with psychiatry? And he remarked, I thought we agreed we won't employ people like you.
Wow, in front of you.
Yes, he made a remark. But the 10-year health plan that has just been published says international doctors will no longer be employed and they will no longer get training opportunities. So even if international doctors came into this country, the expectation is that they do the lower jobs. They're not allowed to train to become a consultant as I did. That was prevalent at the time. They were international
Mm.
doctors, often in hospitals outside of London. If they were in London, you would find them in posts that were not training grade positions to become consultants. So we're going back to what it was like some 38, 37 years ago when I came to this country.
I want to ask this question because I have spoken to some doctors and nurses. My wife is a nurse, for example, and you do see instances of discrimination. And you must be looking at those stories and saying, look, we had it worse back in our days, and you were able to, I guess, take that and turn it into something that worked in your favor. What do you say to people who are currently working in the NHS or in the healthcare field, and they feel like they are facing this discrimination? It's obviously tough, but
Yeah.
what can they do with it?
Firstly, it's not right that anyone should face discrimination. I think we're all agreed on that. But I think that humans, by our very nature, it's inevitable. So I am very fortunate that I have lived both in Nigeria, even though I've lived many more years in this country, and even in Nigeria, there is discrimination. You know,
Mm,
what tribe are you from? Stuff like
yeah.
that. And so discrimination is present everywhere. And what I say to people is if the discrimination is based on the kind of nonsense I just talked about, blanket policy, and in fact, I remember saying to a friend whom I've known, he did his doctorate in a service that I then came in to do my postdoctorate. I remember he and I having a conversation, a white Brazilian, and I said, what I'm looking for is an opportunity for the door to open for me to get through. And he couldn't believe that because he was thinking, my God, you've got your membership, you've got your PhD. What does that mean? I said, well, that's the reality. So if there's discrimination, but there are still opportunities, it's about how do you make sure that if only one person is needed, that you are that one person based on your expertise and what you bring. Because frankly, if you have what people need, inevitably,
Mm,
you know, what I struggle with is people whose everything is colored by discrimination and then they don't even look at themselves or reflect on themselves or reflect on how they can be better. And there are many people like that who are driven by, oh, they don't like me, they don't like us, and therefore, but they're not driven
yeah.
by how can I be better than the next person. It's different mindset.
You did something that I think there's a lot of lesson to be learned from. So there was a consultant that was basically a terror to you whilst you were under them, and then you had the opportunity to get to a higher position, and you decided to appoint them. Was that a power move, or what was going through your mind when you were thinking of doing that?
No, I have to say that power moves are not my thing. Seriously, my and I don't know why this is. My thing is about excellence as much as you can. Um, yeah. So everything I've done, be it appointments, be it challenges, of course, when I'm going through the challenging time, I will moan and I'll be upset or whatever. And it's not also the case that I go away and I plot a way to get out of it. I don't necessarily, but I just believe in just continuously being there and be thinking about stuff that I can do. There are many examples. I recall an example. Someone wanted me to come to them in the Southwest to do some research. I didn't have the money. I hadn't passed my exams, and they wanted me to rent a place, feed myself, and do research for them for free. I said, I really can't. I would love to, but I can't until I pass my exams. I passed my exams, and they were one of the first people I called and said, hey, there's a job going where you are, which I want to apply for. He said, oh, I'm not sure you should apply here. There's a lot of backbiting and stuff. I had no contact with this person for, I don't know how many years, 15, 20 years. I was an examiner, and he was the chief examiner. He says, oh, I've been following your story. You've done rather well. I thought, this is interesting. I had forgotten him. I still remember the whole thing, but it wasn't as though I went off doing stuff to counter him. But I just carried on my own path, And of course, I'm a man of faith. I believe God, but I also believe that God gives you opportunities, and you got to make something of it. And so, coming back to your question about people who are discriminated against, etc., if we're not careful, we focus our energies on the discrimination and not on the opportunity you've been given to make a difference. Really important.
Very powerful.
Really
Yeah.
important.
Because we have time, there's only three more sort of questions that I really want to dive into so that I can respect your time as much as possible. So one thing that you mentioned there is, you're a man of faith, and God brings these opportunities, and it's about how you take those opportunities. Are you facing or focusing on discrimination, or are you focusing on the opportunities that God brings to you? Do you think that a lot of Christians are using faith as crutches? And I know that when we spoke earlier, you mentioned that some people will pray and have faith and just expect success to land on their feet, whereas some people would pray, have faith, and then put the action, knowing that God will bless the action and bring opportunities.
Exactly. I'm of the latter. I'm of the latter. I think that if one isn't careful, you find that people spend a great deal of time on the faith and God this and God that, and lose sight of the fact that we're placed here on earth to work with our hands, and that sometimes it's not just about what we spout, what we say, but it's also about how we do stuff, that attracts people to God. And people say, my God, So one of my mantra is, as a senior person in the NHS, as chief exec, I say to my team, there can be no gossip here. If you want to speak about someone, be sure what you're saying is what you say in front of them. And if you have a view about them, they should know. Because if you don't share that view with them, how will they develop, right? And I have come across some Christians who, unbelievably, almost to the point of hatred, dislike the people they work with, the locals, and you think, really? What is this about? you know? So to what degree, I mean, let's be blunt. There are opportunities that we've all been given. It can't always be perfect, but we need to thank God every day, and then we need to make the best of those opportunities. I keep saying this. Some people think, oh, it's got to be something else, but they lose sight of what they already have in front of them. So I don't think it's necessarily about people. It's all God, 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 or faith, 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 and I think people just need to take a few steps back and just ask fundamentally, what is it I'm asking for? What is it I need of God? And what's God telling me? It's a very complex subject to get into,
Yeah.
but I see this a lot.
Now, this thought and or question, I'll frame it in the form of a question, is one that I have personally tried to get my head around, and I would love to get your opinion on this. So we have instances, you see people commit murder. You see people do these heinous crimes, and you then later hear that they had a mental problem, and then they're put into psychiatry and mental treatment. Do you think that that is a cop out for a lot of cases? Um, because at the end of the day, mental health is something that is required for every single person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everybody
Mm-hmm.
should have a degree of understanding of their mental health,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody battles mental health,
Sure.
some more than
Sure.
others. So it seems almost inevitable that when someone commits a crime, and that's what we're seeing more and more frequently, they say, especially when it comes to murder, oh, the person had a mental issue. We can almost predict it in the news that, oh, that person must have had a mental issue. Is it a cop out? What do you think?
So I don't think it's a cop out. I'll use one example that I've seen, but I want to say a few things. So the outcome in a court of law is dependent on the law.
Hmm.
Of course, the role of barristers is to position the case as best as they can. And I get frustrated sometimes, even with my psychiatrist colleagues, because of the support they give, right? So I'll say that. We run 18 prisons across the UK. And I have visited some of those prisons. I have seen some people who've committed murders and who have been there for years, 20, 30 years. And I have examples that I've come across where people have repented. It wasn't a criminal disposal. Sorry, it wasn't a mental health disposal, but just a criminal disposal, you know. And I'll come back to your question on mental health. I have staff who work in prisons who say to me, I try not to read about the crimes of these people when they then need mental health support, because if I do so, I won't be able to work with them. Yeah, I'll set that aside.
Hmm.
That's not answering your question. But I'll give you an example. I was on call many years ago. I got called to see a young woman who had just been admitted, and there was a real concern that she was being admitted to. The level of security was lower than people thought she should be. And I had to interview her. It was crucial that I made detailed notes because I was the first senior enough psychiatrist to see her. She was very mad, really ill.
Hmm.
She denied that her mother was dead. She said, no, I saw my mother. She looked really old and wretched. And so I wanted her to be reborn. So she'll be fresh and new. And I shouldn't worry, she's going to come back and be fresh and new. She had killed her mother. She had killed her mother. I said, no, your mother is dead. I said, no, she's going to come back. She was very unwell. So there are people who, as a consequence of psychosis, people may say schizophrenia, that's a good example, where something goes wrong in their belief and the voices they hear. I worked with a woman whose son took a knife at a train station and stabbed someone. Why? Because the son didn't see the person as a person, so saw the person as a snake. Although you'll ask the question, why was he carrying a knife, which is against the
Yeah.
law in the first place? But nevertheless, he was already feeling paranoid that something was going to get him. He needed to be safe, so he carried a knife and then had that hallucination. So there
Hmm.
are cases, to answer your question, where people are genuinely, seriously, mentally ill. So we often say, is the person mad or bad? But there are also some people who are really bad, who have no feelings, no empathy, no emotions, and who will do stuff. That's a separate issue. And there are many such people in prisons. And often when you look at their histories, their life from childhood has been blighted by all sorts of heinous and terrible things that there's just no way of feeling for humans. But then there are people who genuinely have mental illness who, at the time of the event, were completely out of, to use
Mm.
their language, out of their minds. And when you see them, it's quite a sorry sight.
Wow. Just a follow-on question
Yeah.
from that. Is mental is this type of illness something that develops over time, or is it something that is just is?
Yes. So it's an interesting, that was largely part of my PhD study. It's an interesting thing. What we do know, if you take schizophrenia, is that in men, generally develops 21, 24 earlier. In women, maybe 28 a bit later. You know, difficult to predict who will have it or not, but there's some evidence that if there's a family history of some form of illness, more likely use of substances may bring it forward if you're predisposed. And so the trouble is that an individual may be experiencing it for months, a year or so, but unless there's a connection, they have a family that's worried about them, they may be withdrawn, they may not be saying much at home, maybe acting oddly, may occasionally say things out of turn, and you say, well, what is that? You may not know. That's what we call the prodrome. So there's often a period of time where something isn't quite right in terms of what the individual is experiencing, but they're not sure what it is. And people they live with, or people who know them, will think, oh, there's something not quite right. And then suddenly, bang, they get into that psychotic phase. And then they start hearing voices, believe all sorts of strange things, etc. Again, fascinating reason why I came into psychiatry, because I saw that as a medical student. I thought I needed to do research on this. I just couldn't understand.
So how can somebody like myself, just just a normal, person, spot these things early, and how can we be of help
Yeah,
to such people?
yes. So I think that one would often talk about odd behaviors, people who use substances, cannabis, LSD, cocaine, etc. You know, where someone's behavior changes from what it usually is. If you're having a conversation and the person is loose, their thoughts are a bit loose, someone who's a bit suspicious and always talks about things that are being done to them, you need to be thinking, well, is there something more here? And give the individual a little bit more time, because if they come across a trusted friend or person, there's a good chance that they might open up to that trusted person about what's been going on, you know. But there's also a good chance, if the person is really smart and able to cover it up, that they won't. Um, but it's really through observation, through conversation, through interactions, you know, any change, any new things that should draw attention.
Okay. Well, Dr. Iffy, it's been a privilege, and it's been a great conversation with you, just so that you can leave us all with one thing. We've talked about your early childhood growing up. We've talked about the mental fortitude that you had to develop at such a young age, structures in place. We've talked about your career. We've talked about so many things. When you look at your life from your view right now, what is that one piece of advice that you would give anybody, life lessons, and say, look, if there's anything you need to know this?
Well, I suppose it's got to be whatever you're going through, stick with it. And if you're a person of faith, believe that you go through it and that there's a lesson that will come in handy further down the line. That's all I can think of. And in fact, when I reflect on my life, there are many things that have happened that if I was stuck in that place and made decisions to the contrary, I may have been off track or whatever.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Ife Okocha. It's been a privilege.
Thank you, Victor.
I hope you enjoyed yourself too.
Yes, I did. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much.